you'll see my colleague Nina Lopez up next to me on your screen. Nina's going to help with back-end technology, and Nina, you could add the link for the native lands again. If you'd like to introduce yourself, we welcome you to give us your name, where you're dialing in from, if you want to use the link to see what native land you're on if you don't know already. And make sure that you select all panelists and attendees in the drop-down menu so that everybody can see your comments. Welcome. Please feel free as you're joining to introduce yourselves in the chat function, making sure to select all panelists and attendees in the drop-down menu. And let us know where you're calling in from, your pronouns if you'd like to share them, and if you'd like to use the link that we have in the chat function to share what native land you're calling in from, we'd welcome that too. I see we have a few board members. Norma and Will have joined us. Welcome, folks, as you're joining. Welcome, and please use the chat function to introduce yourselves. And if you'd like, you can let us know your affiliation, your pronouns, where you're calling in from, as well as what native land you're on. We have a link in the chat function if you need to look that up. We've had a great response to this invitation. About 100 people have RSVP'd, and we hope that all of them will join. Our numbers are increasing as people call in. So welcome, we're so thrilled to have you all here. And we'll just wait a couple more minutes as people are joining. And again, as you're joining, I see Jay Wong has joined and Susan Olson. Make sure when you're introducing yourself on the chat to select all panelists and attendees. If you select all panelists, then there's just only a few of us can see that you've joined. And you can let us know your name, your affiliation, your pronouns, where you're dialing in from, and if you want to share what native land you're on, please do that. We have a link in case you don't know. It's in the chat function, and maybe Nina can post it again. So it's right there in the front. So happy to have you all here. Please, as you're joining, if you'd like, please introduce yourself to the group using the chat function. Make sure to select all panelists and attendees from the drop-down menu so that we can all see you. Otherwise, only the panelists will see you. I see Linda Gabreau. Welcome. Welcome, Kit Miller and Jay Wong. We've had a great response again to this community gathering. We had almost about 100 people RSVP. We hope they will all be able to join. We know last minute things come up. So again, please, as you're joining, use the chat function to introduce yourselves. Let us know where you're dialing in from, what native land you're on, if you would like to share that, your pronouns. And we really welcome you. We're so glad you're here. We'll get started in just a minute. Hi, Roger. Got a great group here today. If you click on the participants function, since we probably are all Zoom experts by now, but if you click down there on the participants, you can see that we have 51 people, and if you click on that, you can see who the attendees are, and we welcome you to connect with each other and also to introduce yourselves to the full group. Make sure to select all panelists and attendees in the drop-down menu and let us know where you're calling in from. I see one of our founders, Tracy Gary, is here. Our board member, Marlene Garcia, just joined. And Marlene, make sure to select all panelists and attendees in the drop-down menu. Otherwise, just a few of us can see you. And I see that people are saying that you don't have a participants button. So never mind. I'll let you know that there's 52 people here now, and we're going to get started in just a minute. Welcome, Elizabeth, another one of our board members. Welcome, Gretchen Sandler, our former board chair. Lisa Paul, former board member. Welcome, welcome. Please introduce yourself in the chat, and also feel free to connect with each other in the chat. If we were meeting in person, we would say we wouldn't want you to have any side conversations, but in the Zoom world, it's completely okay to have side chats with people privately, or if you have questions for the group, you can post them in the chat. We also have a Q&A, so you'll be able to add your questions there. So I think we will get started as people are still joining. Welcome, Dion. Make sure to select all panelists and attendees in the drop-down menu to introduce yourself. Let us know your name, pronouns, where you're calling in from, and what native land you're on. I'm calling in from the Pomo land, Pomo territory up in the Sonoma County area. Welcome, everybody. Okay, well, we're so happy to have you all with us today. We've had a great response to this community gathering for our very, wonderful donor community. And we're thrilled today to just welcome you to be able to connect with each other again. And we convened, a call like this in April. We had a terrific response. It was so wonderful to connect with people and to see people connecting with each other over the chat. And one of the things at that call, we really wanted to share with you all how we were responding to the global pandemic and how we were really using our feminist values and principles to respond. And so that was a wonderful call, and what we really heard also is that people wanted to hear from advocates and activists. So we're thrilled today to bring you Eunisses, Hernandez, and Aria Said, who, in addition to being longtime advocates, activists, both are graduates of our Women's Policy Institute, but they have also most recently been elected onto the Women's Foundation California Board of Directors. So we're really thrilled about that, and we'll bring them to you in a moment. And they will be able to, we'll have a conversation to talk about movement building and what they're seeing, the challenges, the opportunities, and what we need for the long term. What are the current priorities that we should be focusing on? So we'll start that in a minute. Before we do that, we have some survey results that we want to share with you. And before we do that, I just want to introduce my colleague, Nina Lopez, who you see right next to me on your screen. Nina is an executive associate with the foundation, supporting our development and program teams, and she is helping with technology for this webinar. And I'm going to just turn it over to you, Nina, briefly to do some Zoom keeping announcements before we get started.
Thank you, Serena. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Nina Lopez. My pronouns are she and her. I am the Executive Associate at the Women's Foundation. I am sheltering in place in Hayward, California, which is on Ohlone Chochenyo land. Just as Serena said, before we get started, I wanted to share some sort of Zoom tips. Many of you have already been using the chat function to introduce yourselves. Just another reminder to Take a look at the drop-down menu in your chat box and select all panelists and attendees. There you can introduce yourself, say hello to one another, and also ask questions throughout our session. You can ask questions in the chat box or in the Q&A, and I'll monitor them and share them towards the end of our conversation during the Q&A portion. I also wanted to let you all know that this will be recorded and shared in our next newsletter. I think that's about it. So without further ado, Serena, I'll send it back to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nina. And again, welcome everybody. We're going to get started. We'll welcome Eunisses and Aria in just a moment. Before we do that, you will recall that we sent out a survey. And so we just want to take a couple minutes to review the survey results, and Nina will share the slide where you'll see the results. And we asked the same questions prior to our call that we did in April, so we can compare the answers you gave in April to July. And so there's a few things that we noticed in tabulating the results, which is the areas of greatest change are in red, and some in orange. And basically, you know, what we see is that we're feeling, you know, as a community, significantly more tired, quite a bit more angry and lonely and isolated. And while that's, you know, hard to see, it also makes sense because the fatigue of this time that we're in is real. The isolation, the loneliness, makes it extra necessary that we care for and support each other, which is something that we have been doing at the foundation. We have been leading with abundance and compassion and generosity and kindness for one another. And that is so important in this time, as many of us are facing so many challenges, that we recognize our interdependence, and that the rise in anger is also real and reflected in what we're seeing that has turned into such powerful action in the movement for Black Lives protests and the demands for changes in policy and culture. We're also feeling less creative, so we really want to share with one another how we can inspire one another, that we're feeling a little less grateful, but also a little less overwhelmed. And so we just want to, you know, for you to sit with this. I'm sure it resonates for many of you as it does for me. We were just talking earlier at the staff level that even though we've been, you know, quarantining and sheltering in place for the most part for many months now, some of it is just starting to sink in. So it's an uncharted time that we're in, and it's so important to all of us that we have an opportunity to create community with all of you. We also asked about changes in how we're giving. So I'm going to ask Nina to go to the next slide. And, you know, we have thankfully sustained our practices of giving more to friends and family and supporting our own communities. Since we last asked you this question in April, more of us are giving more to different organizations than we typically support. Fewer of us are giving more to the same organizations we typically support. And it's remarkable that none of us reported giving less because of changes to our own financial circumstances. So at Women's Foundation California, we are very much invested in strengthening a culture of philanthropy at our own staff level. We have begun a practice. We're fortunate to have instituted a 2-to-1 giving match. And so every week when we check in as a staff, we talk about where each of us is giving our funding so that we can, our individual giving, so that we can learn about other efforts and continue a process of education, learning about new groups, maybe even combining our dollars for greater impact. So we're really grateful for the giving that our donor community, all of you are doing in these times. It's just so important now, as it has been for many years, but with the kinds of economic impacts that we're seeing, particularly because this pandemic is so gendered in terms of the people who are on the front lines as essential workers. Women make up, as you know, probably 2/3 of low-wage workers, tipped workers, part-time workers. They are our grocery workers for the most part, our retail workers, our restaurant workers who have lost jobs, and exponential members. And also women make up 80% of the healthcare workforce. So it's just so important that we support each other in this moment. So I want to just, before we invite Eunisses and Aria, I wanted to just share a quick update on our fundraising and grant making highlights for the Relief and Resilience Fund. We center all of our grant making in a trust-based and community-led philosophy, and know that now is a difficult time for everyone. So we are requiring no complicated application or narrative process for our grants. We are directly depositing funds with a 14-day turnaround. And as many of you know, we started the fund immediately. As soon as we started working from home the week of March 9th, we immediately distributed additional supplemental support to our core grant partners, knowing that they would also need to adapt to working from home and might not have Zoom memberships or laptops. And so since then, we've distributed nearly $1.7 million in grants, including an immediate cash infusion to our core grant partners in early March, direct assistance to our Women's Policy Institute fellows, increased funding to Black-led and trans-led organizations, and grants to every single domestic violence shelter organization in the state, which is more than 130 organizations just in the DV field. And that is thanks to our partner Blue Shield of California Foundation. So in total, we now have more than 150 grant partners, and we will be making, I believe are making this week, an additional 1.7 million in grants this month and next month. So if you joined us for our last community call in April, you might remember that we had a $5 million goal for, to raise by the end of the summer to get it out into our communities. And I'm so happy to share that that goal has increased tenfold to $50 million. And this is thanks to a first of its kind public-private partnership with the Office of the Governor. And together we have committed to partnering to raise $50 million, and we have raised just about $10 million of that goal. And so that will support short-term needs as well as long-term needs, so that we can be sure to center gender equity and justice as California not only recovers, but restructures. And so we want to make sure that we bring feminist principles to the future of this state. So with that, I'm going to ask Nina to bring Aria and Eunisses so we can begin our conversation. We're so thrilled to have them with us. They have been part of the Women's Foundation California community for many years, and now in a new capacity as two of our newest board members. We have board members, we have a very diverse board of directors in many ways. In fact, we recently changed our bylaws to reflect what has been a long time practice of the foundation to be majority women of color led. And we are diverse in that we have activists, advocates, as well as high net wealth people on our board. It makes for a wonderful group of people. And we are thrilled to be welcoming you both, Aria and Eunisses. So let me just do very brief introductions, because we want you to share your experience with our community of callers here. So Aria, I will say about you that you are a co-founder of the Transgender Cultural District in San Francisco, which is the first transgender district so far as we know in the country and perhaps the world, I'm not sure. And you're the executive director of both the district and the Queen Culture Initiative. And some of you may have met Aria at our 40th anniversary celebration in San Francisco last October, when we were allowed to have hundreds of people gathering in the same room and eating together. Aria and her co-founders of the Transgender District were honored there. We were so really honored to be able to honor all of you at that event. Aria is an alum of the Women's Policy Institute State, and she was in the class of 2017, where her team's policy project passed a policy called the Name and Dignity Act, which was signed into law by Governor Brown at the time. And we believe it's the first bill written by currently and formerly incarcerated trans folks to be signed into law by a governor in the entire country. And you'll hear more from Aria in a moment. And Eunisses is a longtime criminal justice advocate, even though she's young in age. She's the co-founder and executive director of La Defensa. And if you joined us at our Los Angeles celebration, 40th anniversary celebration, you may remember Eunisses was our wonderful MC. She is an alum of both the Women's Policy Institute state and local programs. And her local policy project, Reimagine 109, is currently being heard by the LA County Board of Supervisors. We were a little nervous that she might not be able to join us because I think you had a meeting scheduled with the supervisors, which you were able to change, and we're grateful about that. So I'm going to let you say more about that work. So we just want to welcome you both. And we're going to have a conversation. And so I really want to start with, you know, on a personal level. We want people to be able to get to know you. So Aria, you know, I'll start with you. Just tell us a little bit briefly about how you grew up and how that experience led you to activism and advocacy that you're doing today.
Thank you, Serena. Happy Wednesday, everyone. During the pandemic, am experiencing this moment where the days kind of roll in. So sometimes I'll be like, happy Friday, and people are like, it's Tuesday. But yeah, here we are, it's Wednesday. My name is Aria Saida, she, her pronouns. I am, I'm 30 years old. I'm a double Scorpio. INTJ. On the Myers-Briggs. If anyone knows the Women's Policy Institute, we used to have to do, I don't know if y'all still do it, but we used to have to do the Myers-Briggs assessments at the start of the cohort to see how we can work with each other. And so, yeah, I am from Portland, Oregon. Portland is definitely my hometown. I grew up in Northeast Portland, which, for those who may be surprised, Portland does have Black people there. And it actually has a small but mighty Black population. Historically, that would be in, Northeast Portland. The city of Portland used to do redlining. They probably still do, but they used to do redlining. And so there was a robust Black community that I am fortunate to have grown up in. It's not quite the same as what it used to be, but that informs my experience. So growing up, I grew up in foster care. My birth parents, my birth mom is an immigrant. My birth parents were addicted to crack cocaine during the height of the crack cocaine epidemic in the 80s. And yeah, I think that really sort of informs a lot of my experience to date in the work that I do. But yeah, I started transitioning in high school. And at that time, I had no visible reference points for trans people. I learned of the word transgender from a high school counselor, and I went to the library. This is back when we didn't have computers at home, where you had to go to the library and then like book the computer and use it. And so I asked Jeeves if anyone remembers that, and came across the word transgender and was like, that is exactly who I am. And so I transitioned in high school and really had to navigate a world that didn't know what the word transgender meant. There was no such thing as gender neutral bathrooms. There were no policies protecting trans people. The trans people that I had met were usually white trans folks who were older. And so it wasn't until Isis King came out on America's Next Top Model, I think that was like 2007, 2008, that I actually saw a part of myself reflected on television, and the nation sort of having a conversation on what is a trans person and a trans woman. And so fast forward, I moved to San Francisco when I was 19 years old. Everyone told me San Francisco was the place to be. It's where your kind would be accepted and get a job and, you know, be empowered in the city. And I moved here, I got on the Greyhound bus, and yeah, that's how that was the first time I witnessed trans people walking down the street, coming out of a grocery store, and I was like, oh my God, look, wait, hold on, someone that looks like me, kind of. And yeah, I came up in the Tenderloin. So when I got to San Francisco, no one would hire me. And so I ended up engaging in survival sex trade, and had a deep connection to my trans sisters in the Tenderloin. If anyone has ever been to San Francisco or to the Tenderloin, you might witness that you see more trans people than you would in any other neighborhood. And it's because it holds the densest transgender population of any neighborhood in the country. And so I started working in the local nonprofit, which was the Transgender Drop-In Center at API Wellness at that time. And that's how I got my start in my work. And so, 12, 13 years later, my work has evolved to do transgender empowerment work, in my work with the Transgender District and across the world. I've been able to go to different countries and spread the good news of transgender people, and encouraging people to acknowledge our disparity, but also to celebrate our joy and our resilience, our beauty, our contributions to humankind and the fight for equality. And yeah, I'm so grateful to be a part of such an incredible organization, and an incredible group of women and non-binary folks who are fighting for gender justice. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Aria. And Eunisses, I want to ask you to just give us a little bit of an introduction. I remember we had lunch, it seems like so long ago now, when we were able to go to a restaurant and eat lunch together in LA. And you told me a little bit about your family. You grew up in LA. You, I think when you started working when you started in the Women's Policy Institute, you were working at Universal Studios, is that right? And you were on a very different trajectory. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah, I've been through quite a journey. So I grew up in Northeast LA in this neighborhood called Highland Park. And around me growing up, I saw a lot of people who were my friends, who were my neighbors, impacted by substance use and mental health, but also my family, and also in seeing violence in my community, but also experiencing it. So that made me want to be a cop, because I would be like, I could be the cop that doesn't arrest people. Like I could be the cop that, you know, could have helped my friend. And so instead of arresting him for weed, like he would have actually, like I could have, you know, put him into something else. But when I was in college, like I learned that I couldn't do that. I wouldn't be able to do that. And it's mostly Black and brown people in prisons and jails. And so when I graduated, I had a degree in, you know, bachelor's in criminal justice. And I was like, what the hell am I going to do? I don't want to be an FBI or cop. And even the school that I went to was very like formatted in that way to get you to become law enforcement. So I struggled, and I struggled to find a job in the field. And so I ended up going to Universal Studios because I was like, you know, capitalism, got to make some money, right? And then I fell upon, I think it was by accident, because I was really, I couldn't do Universal anymore. I didn't feel like I was like doing what I was born to do essentially. And so I started applying for internships, and I landed at the Drug Policy Alliance. And in that year, I was introduced to the WPI program. And so at the Drug Policy Alliance, I handled the criminal justice portfolio and did a lot of work on sentencing reform, around sentence enhancements. I got to work with, I was at DPA also when I did the state program. And so I got to work with folks like Emily and Diana Zuniga, who are very much embedded in WPI. So that was, I think, it's been pretty much a life-changing experience, because what got me out of Universal wasn't the best thing that happened to me. I felt like, I felt like my life had been over because I was about to lose my job at Universal. And so this opened up the door to finding this job. But what I will say is that it's been a learning experience as well, going through all of this, because I thought that that we could change the system by being one person, but doing the work and actually learning about the systems, you realize that it's not just an individual, but it's very systemic. And so I think joining the WPI really helped me imagine and learn about the system that we're in. What I do now is I help found an organization called La Defensa, and I'm also 30 years old. So yeah, leadership, yeah. Oftentimes ageism really prevents us from getting opportunities to become leaders, and we don't develop those skills. So I do want to uplift that. Yeah, you can be someone to have this leadership role and not have to be much older, to have some credibility essentially. And so I helped co-found an organization called La Defensa. It's a C4 that works on campaigns, particularly around judges' accountability and judges, because they impact all of our lives, from traffic tickets all the way to family court, and there's no system of accountability for them. And we work on pretrial reforms and implementing alternatives to incarceration. And yes, today we had a meeting about AB 109, which is a particular fund. I won't get into a lot of the details, but when we started our project in 2014 and we were having conversations, nobody cared what we were saying about shifting funds away from law enforcement into services. No one in the county. And then years later, we are now, today they're having a meeting about how they can reassess how they're distributing those AB 109 dollars and seeing how we can invest those into the ATI, which is Alternatives to Incarceration. So it's really been a wild ride to see the transition. But if I could just say, and I'll be candid, that the folks who are moving the work on the ground here in LA County around some of these pieces are WPI alum. And it's the connections that we've been able to generate that have really helped move this forward. Diana Zuniga's in the county. Myself and Yvette Ale are on the ground outside working with Pati, Pati from Community Coalition. So it's not only what we've learned, but also the relationships that we've built. And even Jess Torres, I know they signed up to be on this webinar, but I only really dove into founding La Defensa because I went to a conference where Jess was like, you got to do it. You got to invest in your leadership, and there's resources for that. So I think this has opened a lot of doors, and I'm so glad to be here with you all and humbled, and thanks for the time. Sorry, I'm long-winded.
Not at all. Thank you so much. In fact, I'm going to ask you to say a little bit more, because one of the things that I'm struck about both of you, I knew you were young women, so I didn't know exactly your age, and so this tells me that when you were in Women's Policy Institute, you were in your mid-20s, and I'm just struck by the kinds of policy projects and ideas that you had and were trying to move forward while you were in the institute are really now part of a national conversation. They are, and this is why this session is called From the Margins to the Mainstream. And so, we at the Women's Foundation California are so inspired by you and so many of your counterparts in the Institute. And when I think about you both and others that are part of our broader grant partner community and Women's Policy Institute community, I really think of you as systems changers. And so, you've both come previous to joining the board to come and speak to our board. And Eunisses, I remember when you and Diana Zuniga came last October, you talked about the long-time effort and the coalition that you built to redirect $3.5 billion of LA County's budget that was allocated to build a new jail to mental health and prevention. And you were able to, I was most struck by how you were able to bring the Construction Workers Union on board when they were in fact opposed. And so I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, and then I want to turn to you, Aria, to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that you had and now how it's become also part of the national conversation. So I think of you both as visionaries and in some ways futurist. So, so Eunisses, let me just start with you to tell us a little bit about that work and how it came to be.
Sure, I can start off locally, and then I do want to touch a little bit on the state level. But locally, like I mentioned, our project was in 2014 to really have the discussion around moving millions of dollars away from the sheriffs and probation into community-based services. That conversation is finally getting off the ground today, but it's just one of the things that we've been advocating for. Around that, we've also been advocating for the cancellation of the jail contract for the LA County had, which was worth $3.5 billion for 2 new jails. We were having that conversation at the same time as we were asking for AB 109 funds, because we knew from being in our communities and seeing our loved ones that it wasn't jail that was helping them, it's actually community-based services, housing, the things that uplift the social determinants of health. And so I just want to highlight that piece, that a lot of the projects and proposals that we've come up with are not academic in nature. We didn't, go to school to learn about these problems to like fix them. It's really about our life experiences that inform, what we are trying to push. And our life experiences and the things we've seen happen to our loved ones and friends is that we don't want more jails. It doesn't help us. It doesn't keep our families safe. We want jobs and housing. We know that building 2 new jails is going to be a waste of money, because if you build them, you will fill them. And that means less money into the actual resources that we need. And so that really is what helped us drive our messaging from the get-go. And last year, after being told many times that this was impossible, and after a fight of almost 10 years, LA County canceled its jail contracts to build 2 new jails and moved millions of dollars into funds that expand the Office of Diversion and Reentry, which we've been calling for years. It moved money to build out alternative to incarceration capital projects. And that's really how we got the unions on board for the construction, because well, again, life experiences. A lot of us on our team only grew up with healthcare because our parents had union jobs. A lot of us knew what it meant, that the stability that a union job created. And so when we met with the union, that's what we told them, like, we're not against jobs for y'all. We're not against construction. We're just saying, how about instead of building thousands of new jail beds, we build out a decentralized system of alternatives of care. And so really trying to let them know, let's build out other jobs. We can build out other things. It doesn't have to be jail cells. And so that really helped them get on board, because initially in February, they showed up in full gear with helmets and vests to oppose the county canceling the women's jail. After our conversation with, the trades union around that, they didn't show up to oppose the cancellation of the mental health jail. And so it's a lot of the work that we're doing, we're thinking outside of the box, out of traditional lobbying and outreach, because it comes from our life experiences. So we've been using that to connect with people on a human level, which has been very helpful, not only to move the work, but to build relationships, because we've gotten top secret documents, we've gotten a lot of things and information that normally we wouldn't have gotten if it wasn't for the relationships that we built. So I think that's really what drives this, our vision of our life experiences, and also how we were able to develop relationships with folks. But we've been calling for a lot of stuff that's been happening for years now. And so it's really good to see happen in real life. And also, last thing on the state level, we've been working to repeal sentence enhancement, right? There's issues around sentence enhancement on 3 strikes, drug enhancements, other enhancements for prior felonies. And we really started that in the Women's Foundation, the Women's Policy Institute with our group. That was one of the first bills to repeal any sentence enhancement in California. And since then, there's been subsequent efforts that have also led to further repeals. And now there's even conversations about how do we repeal 3 strikes. So a lot of what's moving, I feel, at least in the vision that I have and in the spots that I'm in, is being driven by what a lot of the conversations that start here or enhanced.
Thank you so much. And you're really pointing to one of the principles that our founders of the Women's Foundation of California, designed for us, that we still live by, which is people who are closest to the problems in their communities are also closest to the solutions. And so, Aria, similarly, when you were in the Women's Policy Institute, I remember that your team had so many ideas of a policy project that was very sort of, let's say, comprehensive, and you really had to kind of pare it down. And yet now much of what you were pushing back then is again part of the national conversation. So talk to us a little bit about how you're seeing that work.
Yeah, I think back then, to be quite honest, we were the first, I think, cohort of trans mostly trans women, but also non-binary folks in the WPI, and we were sort of soaking in the power that that WPI gives its participants to go into these spaces. And so for us, I mean, I know specifically for me and Janetta, we were just Black trans women who used to be sex workers who were advocates, but we were like, we don't have college degrees, like we don't know how to engage in these spaces. And we thought this was our one moment to like try to get all the protections that we could for trans folks. And so we came up with this like huge Bill of Rights with like basically 25 different bill ideas all in one. Like, here you go. This is what we're gonna try to get elected officials to sign on to, and in hopes that it'll protect folks. And I think, you know, with the Name and Dignity Act for incarcerated trans people, we really were just addressing a blind spot in how trans people who are incarcerated do not get any gender affirming rights or protocols, and that traditionally trans people who are prisoners, oftentimes they try to facilitate their requests for hormone replacement therapy or name changes, having government documents be congruent with how they self-identify, going through these protocols that are allegedly these protocols that you're supposed to follow, and then being denied or not going anywhere. And I think now, you know, that policy, as well as like the other policies I've been able to work on since WPI, such as like sex worker protections or gender recognition act, like all these different efforts are really happening right now in seeing how our country is addressing our blind spots, how we have not fully recognized and digested the ways in which some of our communities are more marginalized than others, and that it is systemic, right? That we as people only participate in it, but we can also dismantle it. And so now, you know, it's crazy to me that in 2016, 2017, it was controversial for our policy when we were shopping it around, right? Like elected officials were like supportive, but they were like, oh, I don't know. Like, I don't know if this is the time. Like, you know, we want to support you, but criminal justice is tricky, and, you know, trans people and all this kind of stuff. And now so many more people are talking about, defunding the police. Like, who knew? Who knew that would be a international conversation, right? I feel like abolitionists have been screaming like John the Baptist from the mountaintops, being like, you know, prison abolition, defund the police, you know, decarcerate, et cetera, decriminalize. And they seemed like such radical ideas, like, oh, okay, you're a little far off and crazy. I too was like, oh, I don't know what that really means. Even being in my cohort with the other WPI folks who were prison abolition, I was still like, clutching my pearls, like, I don't know. And now I think to watch the country collectively reimagine a world in which we minimize our interactions with law enforcement in the ways that we have grown up in is just an incredible thing. And I think all of our work, Eunisses' work, my work, Serena, Nina, like everyone here have just been planting seeds, right? And so all of our work collectively has helped to till the soil for where the moment in the movement is right now.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just want to remind folks that if you have questions for Aria and Eunisses, you can use the Q&A function, and Nina will moderate those for us as soon as we move to the Q&A. Before we do that, I know that in my conversation with people, particularly in the donor community who are giving so generously, they really want to know, how is it going for you now? You know, what has the last 4 months been like? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the opportunities that you see? And I'll ask Aria, why don't you start, and then we'll go to Eunisses.
Yeah, so I often tell people that I am in uncharted territory, right? So I'm a Black trans woman executive director of a very highly visible project. Um, and that has been a very arduous journey for me. I'm also, at the time, I was under 30. Now I'm 30. And so I didn't have a guide or a blueprint to work off of, of how to do that. I was never invited to like foundation circles, like those special greetings where they have like the hotel ballroom bread rolls and stuff. Like, I was never invited to those convenings. I had to really learn how to navigate philanthropy because it felt inaccessible for my work, and oftentimes when I would apply for things, foundations would do this thing where they'd be like, "Oh, this is great, but we already fund the trans so and so," and I'd be like, "Oh, well, that's a law project, or that's a healthcare initiative. Like, this is something different." And they're like, "Oh, we already do trans stuff. It's okay," right? And so that was the burden that I was carrying, of wondering how to translate our work in a way that would encourage donors to take our work seriously and know that it was being impactful and that it was addressing sort of the broader landscape of issues that, in particular, Black and brown trans people face. And that, my work was just a part of that. Like, that there's so many different efforts now that are addressing different needs. I think the last few months have honestly been affirming. I don't think I've ever felt this affirmed, where people are finally sort of seeing our work and the work of so many other people and monetarily supporting it or signal boosting it, talking about it. And yeah, I'm still digesting it. And I think foundations that have often said no to us, one foundation sent just a denial letter, and then like 20 minutes later was like, "Actually, sorry, that was a mistake. Like, we fully intend on supporting you and your work." And it's just, I think the affirmation is that that the world is changing and finally listening to us. I think for a very long time, Black trans women and communities of color, women in general, have been seen, and you keep seeing us, but and we're heard, but I don't know if we're fully listened to. And so I think in this moment right now, folks have been responding and listening. I think the challenge is, my own fear is, will this moment go away? Is this sustainable, or are people gonna go back to looking at banana bread recipes? Like, oh, I went to a march and like I made a Facebook post and now I'm going back to my life? Or are people gonna start sort of thinking about the ways in which their life can actually elevate the voices of these communities that they've now had access to and built rapport with in some way, from sharing our work to donating to, actually reading the mission statement and values and program scope on our websites, and, actually learning and listening to our stories. Like, what then will that audience do now?
Yeah, so important what you're saying. First of all, thank you. That is so wonderful to hear that you feel affirmed, and that's a real bright light in this period that we're living in. And it's so important for us to think about, what can we do to sustain this level of support and, solidarity that we're seeing in increased numbers. So, Eunisses, what about you? How have the last several months been for you, and what are you experiencing?
The last several months for me and our team have been incredibly busy. COVID-19 illuminated the racial inequity and underinvestment that has happened in Black and brown and Indigenous communities. It's also highlighted just how unnecessary the legal system is, really. In the beginning of COVID-19, the sheriff of LA County said, you know what? Instead of arresting 300 people every day, we're just gonna arrest 60 people every day. So we can make sure that, there's not as many people entering the jails. Really just like a snap of the fingers, for his decision. Also, there's been other system actors that have been shown to be the weakest links in the system, like the judges, for example. And so COVID-19 has highlighted a lot of those things, but it's also, because it's highlighted those things, it's opened the door for us to have a lot of success during this time, which is incredible. I mean, LA County had the largest jail population in the entire country with an average daily of 17,000 every single day before COVID. That has been reduced by over 5,000 people in just like a timeline of a couple of months, literally just 5,000 people. And so we know that there's thousands more, even more that can be released. But so like I said, we have had a lot of wins, which is exciting. Like we've helped liberate a lot of people. We're shrinking budgets, but it's a very scary time because we are winning. Just most recently, like last week, the sheriff called our coalition out and saying, you know what literally saying calling us out in his Facebook live video over 10 times. And that's just been a little scary to deal with. I think our whole team is just kind of have seen the impacts that the sheriff has had on individual team members. And so there is I'm not gonna lie, we're a little scared about that. But we know that he's doing that and the system is doing that because we're winning and because we're actually shrinking their power and their budget. So it's just been one of the busiest times I think that we've ever experienced. And COVID-19 has opened the door for us to get that done. Great.
So I want to move, I have one last question and then I'll ask Nina to share some of the questions that we're seeing in the chat. But, as I said a little earlier, I think of you two as visionaries, as futurists, like you can predict the future. I mean, look at where we are now. You were talking about defunding the police, years ago. So what does the future hold? And added to that, this is a question from one of our co-founders, Tracy Gary, that where would you direct, people with resources, money, wealth to be funding, whether that's at the, you will be able to do that in your role as board members of the Women's Foundation California. But if you had, let's say, access to, $1 million or $10 million, where would you be saying that money should be going? And also, what do you see as the opportunities? What does the future hold? So Aria, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think we're on the precipice of a really different future than I think I would have predicted a year ago. I actually think it's possible for trans people, Black trans people, to live in a world in which there's not genocide against us, in a world in which we would be economically empowered, and that we would have equal and equitable access to resources in the same way as the broader population. I think our future looks like having honest conversations around domestic violence and abuse, sexual, physical, mental at home in our families, right? And that they're addressed because we've learned the long-term impacts of those incidences. Yeah, I think there's a possibility that the world could defund its police and that community would lead the day-to-day, I don't want to say policing, but because I'm still learning with everyone else on what the world looks like, but but that we would have more of a restorative justice process, right? That our incarceration rates wouldn't have over 50% African American and Latinx inmates, right? Prisoners. That all those things would change. I think with the question about if I had this imaginary budget to give out resources, I think the things that I'm seeing now, the Trans District, we were one of the first trans projects to launch a COVID-19 relief fund. And we opened it up nationally at one point. And so we've given a huge resource out. And I think what the common thread is that trans people, in particular Black trans people, still do not have access to long-term stable housing, still do not have access to jobs, still do not have, you know, cash to get groceries and what have you. And I think, yeah, I think that's obviously a priority for me. That's a huge part of my lived experience. I would love to see people pop up. This has been my daydream, but people with like in-kind resources, like, oh, I have this huge house in the Presidio and you can house trans people there, would be amazing. Or if, if people invested in our futures, something that I'm learning to navigate in my own personal life, as well as, seeing so many members of my community experience is wanting and wishing that people would invest in our long-term future and not just doing a Band-Aid solution for the here and right now. And so oftentimes we see that for here and right now, folks need food or they need, you know, emergency support in this particular way. But what would it look like for us to be thinking about their long-term success? For me, the Women's Policy Institute and being a fellow was an investment into my long-term success, right? And so now I'm like, what would it look like if we invested into trans people wanting to start their own businesses, right? Because we know that the world does not hire trans people. As inclusive as the world is trying to become, if you go to your coffee shop, to your dry cleaners, I mean, everything's closed with the pandemic, but y'all know what I mean. You don't see trans people in those spaces, right? And there's a systemic issue. It's not that we're not applying, it's just that we're not given the opportunity. So we have to create our own economies in order to thrive in the world. And we live at the wills of cisgender people. We have to be validated by cisgender people in order to survive and thrive in the world, because most people on the planet identify as cisgender. And so, looking at longer term resources that would invest in the future of Black people, of trans people, of people coming out of prisons, of folks surviving domestic violence, and the list goes on.
Thank you so much. You're absolutely right. And I'm so happy it's reminding me that Women's Foundation California was the first foundation, not the first women's foundation, the first foundation to sign on to the Grantmakers United for Trans Communities. And so there are resources for donors and foundations about how to do that, where to fund, how to develop leadership of trans people. So thank you for bringing that up. And Eunisses, what do you see for the future? What do you think the priorities should be for donors?
Definitely everything that Aria said. Support that and back that 1,000%. Because then, we'll actually really liberate the folks who have been most vulnerable in our community. So everything you say, I support. I think that in the future, we're going to have departments that no longer exist, police departments or probation departments, because we're going to be in a moment where all the years that we've been advocating for alternatives to incarceration, we're finally going to get some of that implemented. And so I think that's going to prove for itself everything that we've been calling for the last, 10 years, right, in LA County in particular. So I'm very hopeful that we're going to have an alternatives to incarceration department that'll keep law enforcement away from our people, that'll keep our people out of the jails and out of their emergency rooms. I imagine a place where, if one of my loved ones is struggling with behavioral health needs, that I'll be able to walk into a community-based resource program, and they can actually get supportive services that are not punitive in nature, but supportive in nature and life-affirming. That's what we really want to see, like life-affirming community-based resources. And I imagine that happening. I envision that happening because we're doing a lot of the foundational work now. How we're going to get there, though, is really the responsibility and the thing that we should be talking about. One of the things we don't mention a lot is implementation. Oftentimes we get funded to do the work, like, all right, you passed this proposition or you passed this law, whatever, this bill. But what about implementation? Like, that's really where the sexy work is. People don't think implementation work is sexy, but it is, and it's actually what sustains the wins long term beyond our generation of organizers, right? Like we're not here forever, and so whenever we do something, it really has to be very intentional on how we move it forward. So implementation work is something people really need to look into and make sure that they fund all the way through. Also, when you're thinking about how you want to move forward, whether it's in giving of funding or even in moving policy, I always tell folks that you have a responsibility to ask yourself a series of questions, right? Like, one, will your investment leave people behind? Or will your policy leave anybody behind? Or number two, will your policy or investment create things that will have to destroy in the future? Or three, is your policy or investment going to create something that's going to expand the budget or the power of the departments or institutions that we're trying to dismantle because they're harming our communities? And so ask yourself those questions, like, you know, do you want, if you're okay with leaving people behind, that's on you, but just you've asked yourself that question, and it helps us be more intentional and accountable to actually what we're doing, especially in a time where, you know, we're getting a lot of wins, but these institutions that we're fighting for, they are not young institutions. They've been here for decades, and they will fight tooth and nail to make sure that they don't die off. They will do everything they can to restructure themselves, to take over different responsibilities. Like you have LAPD and the mayor just talking about community police, when we should be investing in community members to be community health workers, to actually connect with community and get young folks or people into jobs. We don't need police to do that. They don't need to be social workers. And so really being intentional on how you're actually moving policy. But yeah, if I had $1 million, I would invest it in leadership. As you can see, Aria and myself and others that are in this space, like one of the reasons why we've gotten here, because people invested in our leadership. And so I really am looking forward to seeing the generation classes after us of WPI and what they accomplish, because like we're getting shit done, they're going to get even more stuff done. So I'm really excited about that. I'm going to continue to invest in that, but also maybe at a little bit of a higher level where actually like, yes, you've been a fellow, like how do we get you to be a leader in these agencies, departments, or institutions? Like that's something where we need to start penetrating. And also running for office. Like the people that were on the WPI have a series of values that we've been able to build together. And so how do we get folks like that into political power positions? And I would also invest in that and invest in the implementation of whatever policies we have, because that's critical. And especially now, because like Aria, you said, like, you know, will things revert back? Like, will people go back to making, you know, banana bread? Like, you know, that's why we need to follow all the way through, because we don't want that to happen. We don't want the course to reverse. It's really about how do we cement it in.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you're absolutely right about the power of this network, this Women's Policy Institute network. We're almost 600 strong now. And you know that each of you is connected to thousands of people. And so it's just a little basic math to realize that we can mobilize millions of people in California towards the future that we want to see. So I'm going to ask Nina. Yeah, Aria, go ahead. And then Nina's going to bring some of the questions from the group.
Yeah, for those listening in, I didn't mean to shade banana bread. I am so sorry. I just want to clarify that was not, banana bread did nothing to me. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Okay, Nina, what are some of the questions that we have in the Q&A?
Yes, Susan Olson is wondering if, Susan would love to hear more about efforts to get out the vote this fall. Are either of you doing any organizing around electoral participation?
Truthfully, for me, I have not. I will now. Thank you for that question. I think, to be quite honest, the last couple months I've been focused on like mobilizing folks to protest. So we've been leading a lot of protests in the streets and in response to the murders of Black folks at the hands of police. And, you know, voting is something that I keep seeing surface and I keep thinking of it. I myself have not voted yet, like all these things. And so that is the next, that is the next step. And I do want to be a part of mobilizing community to vote.
Yeah, and to touch on that a little bit, the only reason why we've been able to accomplish all that we've accomplished in LA County around investing in alternatives to incarceration, stopping jail construction and contracts, is because people voted. We have never had a synergy like this on the LA County Board of Supervisors before, where most of them, 4 out of 5, are in agreement that we need care first and not jails, and jails last. That only happened because community members voted good people in, or better people in. And also, the sheriff is a voted position, and he was voted in, and he's been doing a terrible job. He has no political sense. And so and that also, and because he's been a little bit inept, it's reduced the power of the sheriff's department and their credibility. So that's also helped the landscape become a little bit easier to move things forward, because our opposition isn't as strong as it was when it had a more competent sheriff. So we are going to be, and there's several elections that are up in LA County that we're really going to be fighting for and doing voter engagement and get out the vote. That's around Prop 25. That's also about a charter amendment called Reimagine LA County, which would move 10% of general tax dollars in the LA County budget. Sorry, Rosie, which is about $1 billion, into 2 buckets of community reinvestment and alternatives to incarceration, which is unprecedented. Never before in the state of California or in the country has such a big investment been, the opportunity has been put on the table. And so we're 1 week away from getting the Board of Supervisors to approve this charter amendment, to put it on the ballot for people to vote in November. And so, yes, the voting process, never before, I think, has it been more critical and more impactful. If you would have asked me several years ago, I don't know what I would have told you, but now I see the direct impacts that putting good people in office has had in moving and liberating our people. So yes, we have to vote, we have to do voter engagement, and really invest in the political education of our communities, because that's only really what's gonna make the impact.
Wonderful, thank you. Nina, what else do we have?
We have a question from Liza. What have been some of your biggest struggles, maybe particularly around practicing self-care? How do you practice self-care?
I'm learning. I like to share this all the time, but self-care for me, I used to really believe that self-care was like those bath bombs from Bath and Body Works. And like those, like, now they have those facials where it's like a whole wet piece of paper that you put on. LOL. I'm learning that self-care for me is being the parent that I need as a grown-up. So it's the person in the back of my head that's like, girl, you need to eat more vegetables. You need to drink your water. It's 1 a.m. and you're scrolling on your phone, like you should actually go to sleep. That, especially during the pandemic, has kept me a bit more sane. I think, I've not been the greatest at self-care. I think part of the reason why we may be successful in our work is because we're not, even though we're supposed to be practicing self-care, but I've become better at it. I actually just took a road trip to Palm Springs and sheltered in place there, and didn't check emails on my phone for a whole week, which was the first time I've done that in over 10 years. So it was, I slightly regret it just because I'm playing catch up with all the admin stuff that I have to do, but it rejuvenated me and it allowed me to just be me for a few days. And it really helped my mental health stay at a higher morale. So I encourage anyone to take a little getaway, whether it's like Guerneville or hiking or whatever it is, to, obviously practice safety, but yeah.
Yes, I agree with you. I used to think bath and those bath bombs were self-care, and then I was like, wait, I'm still answering emails in the bath. So yeah, I learned that that wasn't gonna do it. And I'm also taking my first vacation next week in a very long time. I can't remember the last time I went on a vacation. It probably has to be like over 4 years now, but I'm truly excited to be able to disconnect, because we were going hard for the jail cancellation contract, and then COVID-19 hit, and so it's been 24 hours almost every day with that. So I'm really looking forward to just unplugging. and letting my brain stop going 100 miles an hour, because that's how I feel like I wake up and it's just go time. So just unplugging.
Yeah, it's so important because earlier in the conversation, you both talked about how we need to sustain this and other people's support and activism. And that won't be any good without your, being sustained in this work. So it's really important to keep that long-term view as you do in view. So I know we're coming up on time. There are lots more questions. And so what I'm going to ask our participants to do is to be in touch with Aria and Eunisses. Follow them if you don't already on social platforms. I think it was through one of your posts, Eunisses, that I learned that 54% of the LA city budget goes to the LAPD, and that is just unacceptable. So so I learn a lot from you all every day. I thank you for being part of this today, for being part of our Women's Policy Institute community, for all that you do. And I'm just so thrilled to welcome you to the Board of Directors of the Women's Foundation California. You'll have your first board meeting in October virtually. And so we're really happy about that. Nina, you're going to put up a slide that has all of our contact information. So, we want to be respectful of everybody's time. We thank you all so much for joining us. Please, as I say, follow Aria and Eunisses on Twitter. You have their websites, and then please be in touch with all of us as well. We really value you calling in. We value you supporting this work with any contribution. Any level of contribution is important to us. We get it right back out into the community, and you can see that it is having a tremendous, tremendous effect. So with that, I'm going to thank everybody for joining, unless there's something that I am missing. Nina, is there anything else that we need to do?
No, I don't think so. Thank you so much, Aria and Eunisses.
All right. Yes, thank you so much. We're so grateful to you for all your work and your commitment and your enthusiasm. You both look fabulous. I don't know if you're getting haircuts, but you look really good. So keep drinking that coconut water, and we thank you so much.
Thank you. Please stay safe.